Welcome to another
Okay,
podcast of
continue.
the Bible GPS. And today we have a special guest. She is Louise Mabille, and she's a researcher. I would like to read to you her resume here. Now, Louise is a researcher currently attached to the Faculty of Theology at Northwest University at Potchefstroom. Her field of interest includes post-Christian philosophy, in particular the hermeneuticians of suspicion. Did I pronounce that correctly, Louise?
Absolutely, the hermeneuticians of suspicion, our good friends, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Charles Darwin, and who am I leaving out?
Freud.
Freud, of course.
Yeah, you're leaving him out.
Well, we don't want to talk dirty tonight, so let's leave Freud out.
Yes. Louise, but you did 2 PhDs. So you have 2 PhDs. Yes. Can you just elaborate on the 2 PhDs?
I've always been fascinated by philosophy. When I remember one incident as a child at a barbecue, I once heard somebody mentioning the phrase, God is dead. And for me, it was a rather terrifying phrase. Not that I grew up very religiously, but for me, it sounded weird. And ever since then, I became interested in philosophy, and I was drawn to the thinker who said it originally. The person at the barbecue couldn't answer it properly. So I wanted to find out for myself. So when I went to university, I really wanted to tackle this question. And I studied philosophy, and I focused particularly on Friedrich Nietzsche, who is, in my opinion, the most important modern thinker. Now, our colleague and friend William might say it's Kant, but I would go with Nietzsche, who was the most challenging thinker and the most important non-Christian thinker for a Christian to study. I did my PhD on his concept of justice, which is based on the Greek notion of decay, which is a notion of justice apart from our common notion of equality and fairness.
And then you have a second PhD as well. You did that in Yorkshire.
Absolutely, at the University of Hull, close to York. As I grew in my Christian faith, I realized that I wanted to do something more distinctly Christian. I mean, Nietzsche is very well to help you think, but Milton lived his faith, and I worked on Milton as a Protestant thinker, not merely a poet. I focused on his prose works, and in particular his defense of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Very relevant topics today, I feel.
Louise, I would like to ask you the following question. What do you believe is philosophy? How will you define what is philosophy?
Philosophy studies all the fundamental questions. When you break any subject down to its most basic level, whether it is art, engineering, mathematics, history, biology, physics, you end up with philosophy. Philosophy studies, you could say, the theory of everything, or the basic nature and character of reality and our relationship to reality.
Thank you so much for that. Now, Louise, you are a scholar in philosophy. How does that contribute to your Christian faith? Because when I studied, I only took philosophy on the first year level. I was very young, and I realized, this is too much for me at this stage in my life. So I took another subject in the second year. I've seen so many students Christian students when they are in a class of this brilliant philosopher, it was so easy for that philosopher to derail their faith. And I've seen it, that students walked away from their Christian faith because of philosophy. So how did philosophy help you in your Christian faith?
Okay, that's a great question, Kobus. There's a common misconception that philosophy stands apart from ordinary life, and that only the specialist does philosophy. But like truth itself, philosophy is unavoidable. Every person in the world has a philosophy, whether it is Donald Trump, Sia Kulisi, Justin Trudeau, or Salvador Dali. We could say that, or ourselves, every person has a basic view or viewpoint according to which they orientate their lives. Mm. So philosophy is unavoidable. For the Christian, being a Christian is a kind of philosophy. And I would say that contrary to the popular view that philosophy is opposed to philosophy, the two are deeply intertwined. Now, I know there's a tragic history, particularly with respect to modernist thought, like particularly the guys I've mentioned, Freud, Nietzsche, Darwin, etc., who and of course Marx, whose work can be used to derail some people's faith. But I have two things to say about that. The first thing is that philosophy is not opposed to Christianity. It is something, philosophy is part and parcel of the Bible, and theology or theologians imply philosophy when they study the Bible. We all accept a version of truth. Even those who try to reject truth ultimately rely on their conception of truth. Now, in modernity, there's this unfortunate situation where a number of prominent ideas, such as positivism, evolution, and of course existentialism, have clashed or appear to have clashed with the Christian faith. However, that only occurs in a particular context. As is the case with science, philosophy, both philosophies, or you could say it goes for philosophy, science, and theology's greatest enemies are not one another, but bad versions of themselves. A bad thinker who's unwilling to really pursue the truth where it leads them, him or her, could easily end up being an atheist. But this brings me to the second problem, and that is, I believe bad theology has driven even more people away from faith. And one of the reasons why bad theology exists is because they don't understand the rigors of philosophy. Once you abandon faith, for example, you don't simply become a rational thinker, as the refrain often goes. You don't, people locally at a circle of thinkers called the New Reformers tend to think that they are ipso facto or automatically philosophers. But if you look at the way they reason, they don't adhere to the rigors of rational thought. Because if you really apply philosophy or do philosophy well and apply the principles of reason well, and look at the historical facts of the resurrection, look at what is really implied under the concept God, and you realize that a purely materialist worldview, for one, has some serious limitations, and not to mention self-contradictions. If you really follow the trail of truth, you cannot help but to end up as a Christian. I would like to use an example of a famous philosopher who ended up a Christian. Philosophy departments are reluctant to admit this, but I'm sure you're aware of the existentialists and the crisis with Christianity after World War II. And one of the most famous thinkers is Albert Camus, famous for his work, The Stranger, The Outsider, and perhaps the most relevant, The Plague. But people think that, particularly when they read something like The Myth of Sisyphus, that he was an atheist throughout his life. But there's a famous and inspiring event in philosophy that's not often recorded or discussed well enough. And that is after Camus began to, or found out what communism really amounts to, he began to clash frequently with Jean-Paul Sartre, and eventually they had a famous break in their friendship. And Camus said, I can no longer endorse communism. And he began to study the Bible again, and he became friends with a minister, and for 2 years he went intensely into theological studies, and he decided he's going to be baptized. And there's a record of that, and we know he in the end he decided to give his heart to Jesus. And a week before he was to be formally baptized, he died in a car accident. But by that time, he no longer had contact with his existentialist friends. Okay. And this is what happens when philosophy is practiced properly. Camus is famous for valuing authenticity above all. He said that you have to be absolutely true to yourself and follow the truth wherever it takes you. Bad philosophy has certainly done a lot of damage, but good philosophy can bring you back right to the Bible and Jesus Christ.
Thank you. You mentioned also pursuing the truth. How can philosophy help us to pursue the truth?
Now, to pursue the truth is to engage in philosophy. It is philosophy helps us to demarcate and recognize the truth when we see it. At the very heart of our encounter with truth lies Aristotle's notion that truth is what corresponds to reality. And in philosophy, this is called the correspondence theory. Now, there's also the pragmatic theory of truth, which is that truth is what works. But that's not a postmodern theory. It's truth has to work for us in everyday life before we can it can be recognized as truth. And this is the really important function of formal philosophy. It sets the criteria according to which we can say X is true. For example, when you speak of historical truth, it could say that, well, that part of history, historical studies, which allows us to recognize X as true, is a domain that's actually demarcated by philosophy. When we argue, for example, about something like vaccines. Implied in that conversation is philosophy of science, with questions like, how many times does an experiment have to be repeated before we can safely say this counts as true? Ultimately, that's a philosophical judgment and not a purely scientific one, which brings us back to the original statement that philosophy is the theory of all the other subjects.
Thank you so much, Louise. You mentioned that even bad theology can be dangerous, and I agree with that. You are a philosopher, but can you maybe give me an example of bad theology that is dangerous?
Yes, an example of bad theology would be the notion that all faiths are true, and or that anything you believe can be true for you. And that's a typical postmodernist position. But there's just no way that that position can work in either abstractly or even practically, because as the great modernist philosopher Immanuel Kant said, for something to count as true, it has to be consistent. And bad theology, with its nihilistic openness to everything, is ultimately inconsistent, because what bad theology, which ranges from figures like Deepak Chopra, New Age kind of stuff, to postmodern interpretations of the Bible, like work by John Caputo, for example. What they neglect is the very demand that truth makes upon one, that the moment you go out and study, you assume that what you're going to study is worth something. That postmodern theology abandons the very value of its own subject, because if every position possible to be held by anybody is equally valuable, why bother studying in the first place? You could just stay the way you are. Other examples of bad theology, and this could get a bit complicated, is the what I call the ideology of morality. The idea that, okay, if you lead a good life, you're spiritual, or that's good enough to inherit eternal life. Mm. And that's clearly none of the major religions, aside from Christianity, and of course it's in the Bible, that it isn't the case, that it's simply not good enough to just lead a moral life. But if we take it a bit further, our cynical friend Friedrich Nietzsche, the one that I referred to, would say that this desire to just lead a moral life is by itself far from an innocent phenomenon. And perhaps this is the most valuable part of philosophy. It shows us that the notion that many free thinkers, atheists, Enlightenment thinkers, liberals, and rationalists have, that they are neutral, that they are objective, they're thrown off the burden of faith, and now they're open-minded and tolerant. Now, Nietzsche would say to that, the desire to occupy that position is by itself a power play. It's not an innocent phenomenon. And Nietzsche writes specifically in Twilight of the Idols, what the Germans lack, section 5, where he speaks in great contempt of the post-Christian liberal Europeans. He says that what they think morality is particular to Christianity. Once you're done with the Christian faith, you have to let go of basically all of the assumptions of Western civilization. Because as he shows, something like the golden rule is not an objective fact, but something which developed slowly and painfully throughout the history of Christianity. The idea that every individual has inherent value. It's by no means an objective neutral fact. It's a product of Christianity. And this is another reason why I believe, again, perhaps not the best argument that's ever been made, but for our faith, but I believe at the same time a very important one. There's nothing left. There isn't an alternative. It's either Christianity or nihilism, as Camus has also seen.
Can you just unpack nihilism a little bit for us?
Yes. Nihilism, to quote our German friend again, in the Will to Power section 2, is when values devalue themselves. You could say it's when you buy shares in a company, but the company goes bankrupt. So it's the bankruptcy of values. And I think it is a problem that we're facing in the world today, that the values that the modern West from the 18th century onwards had taken for granted, such as the value of reason, fair and open conversation, the reasonableness of people, objective truth. That's in greater danger than it's ever been. And the experience of this is what we call nihilism. In something like in radical phenomena such as the transgender movement, we see what the French philosopher, who spent a great deal of time in Canada, it so happens, Jean Baudrillard, calls a crash of values or trans phenomena. And it is when you have a total disintegration of something like gender norms, all the rules that make civilized society possible. And that's what nihilism ultimately is. In aesthetics, which is also a very important part of philosophy, the study of beauty, why we call certain things beautiful and others not. When we find a situation where all forms of distinction, all ideas of quality, and all standards disintegrate, human life as we know it today is no longer possible. And that is nihilism. We could say that shortly before the fall of the Roman Empire, the Romans and the ancient world in general, the Hellenistic world, experience a great deal of nihilism. And that in the everyday sense of the word, it means that people no longer attach value to the things that they used to value.
Interesting. I read a quote the other day that, especially in the Western world, that everything offends people but sin.
Yes.
And I experienced the phenomena of nihilism. There's a total disintegration of things, and people talk about inclusiveness. They talk about free speech, but as soon as your speech is different from those people who want free speech, they frame you and they don't embrace it. So we live in a very I can say, maybe a dangerous society. Do you believe that nihilism is maybe one of the reasons why people feel they don't have really identity? You talk to psychologists, there's more and more people experience life as meaningless. Depression is on the increase, suicide. Do you think those two relate to one another?
Oh, absolutely. What's interesting is that we could say, well, interesting and sad. Um, I'm sure you are familiar with your compatriot Jordan Peterson, who
Yes.
addresses precisely these questions.
Yes.
And he has said at one stage that it's possible to argue that a person living today is considerably more unhappy than anybody's ever been during the medieval period. And the reason for that is things no longer make sense. The media is no longer as truthful and authentic as it used to be, say during World War II. What's very important is that we as people, as Westerners, no longer share stories, a great coherent meta-narratives, as we once did. A meta-narrative is a great story that helps us to orientate ourselves and to make sense of the world. Once, Christianity was the official faith of the world, and it helped the world to develop civilization, to lead coherent lives, and to make sense of life on a personal level. Today, the West has turned so much um, against Christianity, but in the name of what they think is an ultimate um, objective justice, a fairer dispensation than Christianity was able to offer the world. But what I find amusing about that, or rather not amusing when I think of the dishonesty behind it, is that they still imply a standard or a picture of justice, which is ultimately derived from Christianity.
Yeah, that's fascinating things that you are saying. So while listening to you, it is wonderful to know that, Louise, you have confirmed that every one of us are actually philosophers because we have a view on topics and on things. And we need to
Yes.
become better philosophers. And I think what I sense from you, that philosophy help us to have a better view on things and to ask the
Yes.
right questions. Am I right when I make that assumption that philosophy really help us to have an overview of things and don't be drawn into a certain narrative, but be objective and ask better questions?
Absolutely. I think most of us have the desire, the natural desire to ask questions. I'm sure we all remember our teenage years when you wanted to
Yeah,
question the world.
yeah,
But philosophy sure helps you to avoid drugs instead of finding solace in something else.
yeah.
Drugs, even art, or just music, or an alternative lifestyle. It helps you both to pose the questions rationally, that will, in a way that it will continue or help you to make sense throughout your life, but it also gives you the answers.
Mm,
There are very few questions that philosophy can't answer.
mm. Interesting. There was a graffiti one day, Louise, and someone wrote, Jesus is the answer. And then someone came and wrote below that, but what is the question? So if you would have answered that, what do you think is the question? If Jesus is the answer, what is the question?
That is brilliantly put, Cobus. I would formulate the question in I can give two possible ways. Is what allows me to make sense of the world, or alternatively, what makes life worth living? Now, as Christians, we know that not only does Jesus make life worth living, a relationship with him gives sense to our lives, but not only this life, it answers he answers the greatest, the most fundamental biological problem that we all face, and that is something that we should consider, particularly during the age of COVID-19, and that is our mortality. To get back to Camus, he said that at one stage, he said that the most fundamental question in the world is, why do we continue living? Why don't we just commit suicide? And as we saw, even he couldn't continue with that way of thinking throughout his life. And I would say the answer to that is because a relationship with God is possible. You don't have to do it all alone. Yes. And that is the greatest comfort anyone can know. You don't have to do this alone.
That's so true. The other day, I was reading something, and I also mentioned it in one of my messages, that as Christians, we are believers as well as belongers. You cannot just say, I believe. You need to belong as well, because we need to do life together. Like when you look at Adam, when he was in the garden, God saw Adam, and Adam had the perfect relationship with God, but that was not enough. God said that he's alone, I will make him a helper. So we need one another, and
Absolutely.
we experience God through other people as well. And
absolutely, Kobus, but this brings me to a very important point, in that unfortunately a great many postmodern philosophers, such as Emmanuel Levinas, focus so much on that relationship. Contemporary feminists do that. People like Judith Butler, and they talk about relationality. But this is precisely the question, or the problem, that relationships between people are not enough. You need something or someone else.
Correct. So, Louise, it seems to me, with all your years of study as a philosopher, as a researcher, that there is no opposition of philosophy and your Christian faith. But I sense that philosophy is actually helping to embrace your Christian faith.
Oh, absolutely, Kobus. I'm a very theoretical person, and I spent a great deal of my time in academia. So I like to take a view from a distance, and I live very rationally, if I may say, and it's for me, philosophy is a very helpful helpmeet to theology, because it helps you to elucidate, to see what the questions really are. Because it's possible, and this is something that I would recommend to all Christians, read texts, of course, study the Bible, but see how other books relate to the Bible. There's so many other books have been written in the light of the Bible. People have written against it. People have disagreed with it. People have hated it. People have, of course, loved it. But this is precisely what makes it so powerful. You cannot ignore it. And philosophy helps you to think, to really think about the contents of the Bible. We're all familiar with the parable of the talents. And in a shallow way, we could say that it just means to use our talents, like go out and sing, go out and study. But that The parable of the talents is not something that tells you just to go out there and do something, but it's in fact a very Greek notion of teleology. Aristotle would have understood it. It means it doesn't mean do a job, but reach your potential. And that potential is an Aristotelian or a Greek idea. Aristotle used the image of the acorn, and he said its nature or its aim or its telos is to grow, and to grow into a fully grown, healthy, healthy tree, and to become what it ultimately is. And if you really see how much truth, how the truth of the Bible and the truth of the great philosophers overlap, you realize that the Bible really has to be true if there's so much overlap in its content. Correct. With the greatest minds that humans have produced.
Correct. Yeah, some people say, if the Bible wasn't the truth, why is it banned in so many countries?
Exactly, it's something that you can't ignore.
Correct.
I don't think Harry Potter is banned, so you don't ban something unless you're truly afraid of it.
Correct. You mentioned something, Louise, that you're a very rational person. That reminds me of what Paul says in Romans 12, that we don't need to conform to the pattern of this world. And that is a philosophical statement, I think. Don't conform to the pattern of this world, but we need to be reformed. We need to become the people God wants us to be. And then Paul gives us the way to do it. He says to renew your mind. Christianity has a lot to do with the mind, the way we look at things, the way we think about things, the questions we ask. So it's actually amazing that philosophy is actually a friend of theology. And theology means... I just want to come, I like the etymology of words. Theology, I believe, comes from two words, theos, which is God, and logos, which is words about God. So Louise, I would like to wrap up our conversation, and I would like you to help us to understand where the word philosophy comes from. Because I really like etymology of words.
Oh yes, now you sound just like my old pal Friedrich Nietzsche, who says that in a word you can read an entire history. Philosophy literally means love of wisdom. However, it is much more than just a passive esoteric phenomenon. It is the active pursuit of truth. It includes things like the criteria of verification and falsification, the questions like the pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of meaning.
Thank you so much for that. I like that you've also included the word beauty, because I would like to have a podcast with you only on that theme of beauty, because I think we miss that in our society, because beauty is the one thing that will rid you from self-centeredness. So thank you very much, Louise, for your time, helping me also to understand that philosophy is actually our friend. We are actually all philosophers. That was encouraging to know as well. And philosophy is really, as you've said, that it is the love of wisdom, and wisdom helps us to be better with life. So thank you very much, Louise, and all the best for you.
Thank you so much, Kobus. I would just like to end with a message of my own for all Christians listening to this. Don't be afraid of philosophy. The message of God's word cannot be contradicted by other truths. In a way, philosophy is just another way to God, because truth is truth. And don't let any postmodernist convince you otherwise. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you for those profound words, Louise.